The wind carried dust across the broken city as the ground shook under hidden machines. The ruins looked dead, but every shadow seemed to hold waiting eyes. Human scouts whispered of strange movements at night. No one knew when the enemy would strike, but everyone felt it was close. Fear made silence heavy in the air. Daniel, a soldier scarred from years of battle, walked through the rubble with his sword strapped across his back. It was not an ordinary blade. Its metal shimmered faintly under the dying sun. He never explained why he carried it, not even to his closest brothers in arms. Some laughed at him, saying it was useless in an age of rifles and plasma cannons. Yet Daniel never let go of it, as if guarding a secret promise. The first attack came when the sky split with thunder. Alien ships roared above, tearing through the smoke and clouds. Their beams burned holes in towers that had already been half destroyed from past wars. The ground cracked open as armored alien warriors marched out. They were tall, with glowing skin and blades that sang like metal storms. Their eyes carried fire, and their movements were too fast for untrained men to follow. The unexpected war had begun. Human forces scrambled to defend the last stronghold. Daniel rushed to the front lines, pulling men to cover, shouting orders like he had done 100 times. But this was not like other wars. The enemy fought with fury, as if every strike carried personal hate. Soldiers screamed as energy blades sliced through metal and flesh. The city walls trembled. Daniel tightened his grip on his sword. It was the only thing that gave him calm. He whispered to himself that his last strike was not meant for these common battles, but for something greater. As night fell, fire painted the ruins. The humans pushed back with tanks and drones, but the aliens cut through them with shocking ease. In the middle of the chaos, Daniel saw her for the first time. She moved like a storm-given form, her hair a river of fire, her skin glowing with strange blue light. Her armor looked both ancient and alive, as if it grown from the bones of her world. She struck down soldiers with a single sweep, and the ground itself shook when she landed. Daniel knew at once she was no ordinary warrior. She was a commander, perhaps more, and she was searching for something. Their eyes met across the battlefield. For a moment, the noise faded, and all Daniel saw was her gaze fixed on his sword. She paused, her blade lowering slightly, as if recognition struck her. Then she smiled, not with kindness but with certainty. She shouted words in her alien tongue, and her soldiers turned their focus toward him. Daniel understood then that this war was no accident. They had come for him, or for the weapon he carried. Bullets and beams rained around him, but he moved forward with a steady calm. Men screamed for him to fall back. Yet he pressed ahead, the sword glowing faintly as if sensing its moment. Every step he took drew the alien commander closer. She wanted the blade, but she wanted him too. He felt the weight of fate in his chest. He knew the war had only just begun, and the true reason for his weapon would soon be revealed. The night did not end with silence. It carried the cries of the wounded, the rumble of distant machines, and the sparks of fires that refused to die. The human camp was broken, yet Daniel still stood with his sword resting against the rubble beside him. His men watched him as if the weight of their survival sat on his shoulders alone. He said little, but his presence gave them strength. They did not know that he carried more than courage. He carried the last promise of his weapon. At dawn, the battlefield revealed the damage. The ruins looked worse than the day before, as if the city itself wanted to collapse. Bodies of both human and alien warriors lay scattered, and the air smelled of ash and iron. Soldiers whispered about the alien commander with the fiery hair. Some said she was more than a leader. Some claimed she was royalty. Others feared she was something closer to a god. Daniel did not answer them, but he could not shake the memory of her gaze locked on his sword. The council of human officers gathered in a broken hall. They argued over whether to retreat or strike back. Maps were thrown across tables, and voices rose in anger. Daniel stood in the corner, silent, until one general asked why the alien commander had focused so much attention on him. Daniel's hand brushed the hilt of his blade. He spoke calmly, saying the enemy wanted the sword, not the city. His words silenced the hall, but it also planted fear. If the sword was the reason for their suffering, then was he a danger to them all? That night, Daniel walked alone beyond the camp. He carried the sword in his hand, feeling its strange pulse echo through his veins. The weapon had been with him since his father passed it down. Stories claimed it had once belonged to an emperor who had united worlds. Daniel had never believed those tales, but the way the alien commander stared at it made him question. The blade shimmered under the moonlight, as if listening. He whispered to it, asking if its last strike was truly waiting for her. The silence answered back heavier than words. The next attack came sooner than anyone expected. Alien ships returned, not in numbers as large as before, but precise and controlled. They did not spread across the city. They aimed directly for the human camp. Daniel knew it was no ordinary strike. They were hunting him. He called his men to arms, and the battlefield lit once more with fire and steel. He fought with precision, his blade cutting through alien armor, as if it remembered the battles of long ago. Yet with each strike, he felt the commander drawing closer. She appeared again at the heart of the chaos, her eyes fixed only on him. Her soldiers circled, but she gave them no order to kill him. Instead, she advanced slowly, her blade humming with energy. Daniel's men tried to shield him, but she cut them down with merciless speed. He raised his sword, its glow now bright and alive, and their clash thundered like two storms colliding. Sparks filled the air, dust rose in waves, and both sides paused to watch. This was no simple duel. It was destiny unfolding before their eyes. Their swords clashed again and again. She moved with elegance and rage, her strikes sharp as lightning. He fought with raw strength and patience, each block measured, each step firm. Between the blows, she spoke in fragments of human tongue. Her voice was sharp, but her words carried weight. She asked why he still held the sword of the fallen emperor. She demanded to know if he understood what it meant. Daniel said nothing, only meeting her strikes with his own. Yet inside him, questions began to burn. Was the sword truly his? Or was he only guarding something that belonged to history? At last, she pressed her blade against his, their faces inches apart. Her voice was cold but steady as she whispered that the final strike of the sword was promised her long before his birth. Daniel's eyes burned with fire. He said the sword's last strike was not given. It was saved, and if fate demanded it, then he would be the one to decide when that moment came. The battlefield fell silent as their voices carried across the ruins. Both sides knew this war was no longer about armies. It was about two warriors, one blade, and the promise of its final strike. The clash between Daniel and the alien commander did not end with a victor. Their blades met again and again until the dust choked the air and their bodies ached from the weight of battle. Neither yielded, and both knew that killing the other was not the true purpose of fight. The soldiers on both sides hesitated, unsure whether to charge or watch. For a moment, the war seemed to wait on the outcome of two fighters bound by something greater than orders. When the alien commander finally withdrew, it was not in defeat. She pulled back with slow steps, her fiery hair sweeping across her shoulders, and her gaze never left Daniel's sword. She spoke words he did not fully understand, but her tone was not a mockery. It was closer to respect, mixed with challenge. Then she vanished into the smoke, with her warriors following. The silence that remained was heavier than the battle itself. Men gathered around Daniel, asking why she spared him. He offered no answer. He only sheathed the glowing blade, his mind burning with questions. The officers were restless. They pressed Daniel for explanations, demanding to know what the alien had meant by her strange words. Some believed he was cursed. Others whispered that he was chosen. Rumors spread quickly across the camp, and soon soldiers looked at him with both awe and fear. Daniel carried the weight of their stares with calm discipline. He did not tell them that he felt the sword's power growing with every battle. He did not share that the blade seemed to awaken more each time it clashed with hers. That night, sleep refused to come. Daniel sat by the ruins of a shattered tower, staring at the weapon resting across his knees. He thought of the stories his father had told him, of an emperor who once united worlds under a single banner. The emperor's sword had been said to carry one final strike, a blow that would shape the fate of galaxies. Daniel had never believed those tales until now. The way the alien commander moved, the way she spoke, the way she sought the sword with burning eyes, all of it told him the legends were true. When dawn came, The war did not wait. The aliens launched another strike, this time targeting the supply lines that fed the last human stronghold. Explosions tore through caravans, and chaos spread like fire through dry grass. Daniel led his squad to defend the routes, his sword gleaming as he cut down armored foes. His men fought with renewed spirit, drawing courage from his unshaken stance. But for every victory, another wound opened across the battlefield. The war was not just about holding ground. It was about time, and time was running thin for the humans. As the battle raged, Daniel once again felt her presence. The commander appeared at the far ridge, her armor glowing with the light of the twin suns overhead. She moved like a storm down the slope, and every alien soldier parted to give her way. Daniel knew she had come for him again. He raised his sword, and his men instinctively stepped back, as if fate demanded this duel alone. The ground shook as they met, blades clashing with thunder that drowned out the cries of war. Every strike seemed to echo not just in steel, but in the hearts of all who watched. This time, she spoke more clearly. Her words carried in broken human tongue, yet the meaning was sharp. She told him the sword belonged to her people, that it was forged not for him but for her bloodline. She claimed it was stolen long ago, and that only she could awaken its true power. Daniel's jaw tightened as he fought back her strikes. He answered with the truth he carried, that the blade was passed him not by theft but by inheritance. He declared that he would not give it up, not to her, not to anyone. The steel between them screamed with every clash. At last, their blades locked again, neither moving, their faces close, their breaths ragged. She whispered that the last strike was not his to save. It was hers to claim by right of destiny. Daniel stared into her glowing eyes and felt the weight of her words pressing against his spirit. But his answer was calm, steady, and unshaken. He said destiny was not written in bloodlines or legends. Destiny was written by the hand that held the sword and the will to decide when to let it fall. Around them, the war raged, but in that single moment the world seemed to stand still. The war spread across the land with growing fury. Villages burned, skies darkened with smoke, and rivers turned black with ash. The human defenses weakened as the alien armies pressed harder each day. Yet, wherever Daniel fought, the tide shifted. His sword shone brighter with every battle, and men rallied behind him as if he were more than a soldier. They began to call him the last hope, though Daniel carried that name with silence. He knew the true weight of the blade was still hidden. The alien commander became a shadow that never left his mind. Her fiery hair and glowing eyes haunted his thoughts as much as her voice. She claimed the sword was hers, but Daniel felt the weapon bond with him as if it chose him each time he raised it. At night, he sat alone, tracing his hand over the strange markings etched into the blade. He could not read the symbols, but sometimes he felt them pulse with life, like a heart beating within the steel. The promise of the last strike pressed against his soul, like a storm waiting to break. The human council argued constantly. Some believed Daniel should use the sword's final strike immediately to destroy the alien commander and scatter her forces. Others demanded he hide the weapon and keep it away from the enemy. Daniel listened but spoke little. He knew the sword was more than a weapon of destruction. Its last strike was not something to waste in desperation. He believed it carried a meaning deeper than fire and blood. Yet explaining that to generals who counted only losses and victories was nearly impossible. One evening, Daniel's squad captured an alien scout who had been left wounded after a raid. The creature's skin shimmered faintly, and its voice was sharp but weak. When Daniel pressed him about the commander, the scout spoke with fear. He said she was not only a warrior, but also a seer, a chosen one of her people. She had foreseen the return of the Emperor's blade, and she believed it would mark the rise of a new age. To her, Daniel was not a man with a sword. He was an obstacle standing in the way of her destiny. The next dawn, the alien commander came again. This time she did not march with armies at her back. She came alone, walking through the smoke toward the human lines without fear. Soldiers raised their rifles, but Daniel ordered them to hold fire. The commander stopped only when she stood within striking distance. Her voice was steady as she asked him why he fought against fate. She told him the sword was meant to end worlds, not to guard dying cities. Daniel's answer was simple. He said a sword only became what its bearer chose, and had not yet chosen its final strike. Her laugh was sharp, but her eyes were not without respect. She told him that his strength proved he was worthy, but worthiness did not erase destiny. She challenged him again, and their blades met under the rising sun. The duel stretched across the ruins, their movements like storms colliding, every strike shaking stone and steel. The humans watched in silence, unable to move, while the aliens stood at the edges, unwilling to interfere. It was no longer a war of armies. It was a trial between two wills that refused to break. As their swords clashed, Daniel began to feel something deeper awaken within the blade. Every strike sent waves of energy through his arm and into his chest. The markings glowed faintly, and the sword hummed as if remembering its ancient power. The commander pressed harder, her blade ringing with fury, but Daniel pushed back with resolve born not from bloodlines but from choice. With each blow, he spoke through his silence. He would not give her the strike she demanded. He would save it until the world itself decided it was time. Their blades locked again, and she whispered that he could not hold it forever. She promised a day would come when he would face her without escape, and on that day the sword's last strike would fall for her. Daniel met her burning gaze without fear. He told her that if fate demanded their meeting again, he would be ready. But until then, the sword would remain his, and its final strike would remain unspent. Around them, the battlefield waited in silence, as if the world itself held its breath for the choice yet to come. The days after their duel were filled with uneasy silence. Both armies waited for the next strike, but neither side moved with the same rage as before. It was as if everyone knew that the war had shifted into something larger than tactics or numbers. The humans rebuilt their walls, and the aliens gathered in the shadows, but all eyes remained fixed on Daniel and the blade he carried. The sword had become more than a weapon. It was now the center of the war itself. Daniel felt the burden pressing heavier each day. Soldiers came to him, not only for orders but for hope. They spoke to him as if he were chosen by fate, and their belief in him grew stronger with each passing hour. Yet Daniel did not see himself as chosen. He was a man holding on to a weapon that carried a past too deep for him to fully understand. The blade pulsed with quiet energy, and sometimes at night he thought it whispered through the wind. He reminded himself that its last strike was not meant for despair, but for something greater. Rumors spread that the alien commander had returned to her people. Some claimed she was gathering new armies. Others whispered that she sought counsel from the seers of her world. Daniel knew she would return, and when she did, it would not be with half measures. She would come to claim the sword once more, and this time she would not leave without forcing a choice. The thought tightened his chest, but it did not shake his resolve. He would face her as many times as fate demanded, but the last strike would remain his decision. The human council grew more desperate. Supplies thinned, morale faltered, and whispers of surrender filled the air. Generals demanded Daniel use the blade's final power to crush the alien forces once and for all. They did not understand that such a strike could not be wasted on desperation. Daniel told them the sword would not be unleashed on command. It would strike when the true moment arrived. His words angered them, but none dared take the weapon from him. They knew in their hearts that even if they tried, the sword would not answer to them. One evening, as the camp settled into restless sleep, Daniel walked beyond the walls again. He stood among the ruins and looked toward the distant horizon where alien fires burned. His mind was heavy with thoughts of the commander. He wondered if she too felt the same weight when she held her blade. He wondered if destiny had bound them together long before either had taken up arms. The night sky stretched endless above, stars burning like silent witnesses. Daniel lifted the sword to the heavens and whispered that he was ready when the true hour came. The next morning, the alien forces struck with fury. Their machines rolled across the plains, firing beams that split the earth open. Towers collapsed, and fire washed over the defenders. Daniel rallied his men, leading from the front as always. His sword cut down wave after wave of armored warriors. Each swing carried a strange light, as if the blade itself was fighting beside him. The humans pushed back with everything they had, but the storm was relentless. And at the heart of the storm came the commander once more, her eyes locked only on him. This battle was fiercer than any before. She moved with greater speed, and her strikes fell like lightning. Daniel matched her with steady strength, his blade answering every blow with power that made the ground tremble. Around them, soldiers froze, watching in awe and fear. They both fought not as simple warriors, but as forces of fate. Every clash of their swords felt like history itself being written before their eyes. Dust rose in choking clouds. Sparks filled the air, and still neither yielded. At last, their blades locked again, pressing hard against each other as if the world hung on their struggle. Her voice broke through the roar of battle, sharp and steady. She told him that every strike he saved only delayed the future. She warned that the sword's power could not sleep forever. Daniel's eyes burned with fire as he answered that he knew the truth. The last strike was not a gift to her or a curse to him. It was a choice that belonged only to the one who carried it. And until the final moment revealed itself, his hand would not let it fall. The war had reached a breaking point. Both armies had lost too much, and the land itself was turning into wasteland. Smoke covered the skies, water turned bitter, and the cries of survivors echoed in ruins. Yet even as the world seemed ready to collapse, neither side surrendered. The humans fought with desperation, and the aliens fought with conviction. At the center of the storm stood Daniel, the man with the sword, and the commander who claimed it was her destiny. Daniel began to notice something strange after their last duel. The sword grew heavier in his hands, not with weakness but with meaning. Each time he drew it, the blade pulsed brighter, and the ground around him seemed to hum with hidden power. His men whispered that the sword was alive, that it was guiding him somewhere. Daniel did not know if they were right, but he felt the weapon pulling his steps towards something unseen. He sensed that the last strike was not just about the commander. It was about the fate of all who lived under the broken sky. Scouts reported strange movements deep in the desert. Alien forces avoided those places, and even human soldiers felt dread when they passed near them. Daniel listened carefully and understood. The sword was pointing the way. He led a small band of fighters into the sands, following the pulse of the blade. After days of harsh travel, they found a canyon carved with ancient stone. Symbols glowed faintly on the walls, the same markings etched into Daniel's sword. His men looked at him with fear and respect. He stepped forward alone, knowing this path was meant only for him. Inside the canyon lay a hidden chamber. The air was thick with age, and the silence pressed against his chest. On the walls were carvings that told stories of an emperor who once ruled stars. The emperor had carried the same sword, uniting species under his banner. The last strike was carved clearly into stone, not as a weapon of death, but as a key. It was shown as light that shattered chains, light that ended slavery and bound enemies into allies. Daniel stood still, his breath heavy. The blade he held was not meant only to kill. It was meant to decide what worlds would become. As Daniel traced the carvings with his hand, shadows moved behind him. He turned, ready for battle, and there she stood. The alien commander had followed, walking into the chamber with no army at her back. Her eyes burned in the dim light as she looked at the walls. She seemed less like a warrior now, and more like someone who had chased this truth her entire life. She told him that the sword belonged to her people, that its power was promised to restore her world. Daniel answered that the sword did not belong to bloodlines but to whoever carried its will. The two of them stood in the chamber, their voices echoing against stone. For the first time, their blades did not clash. Instead, they looked at the carvings together. She spoke a prophecy of how her seers had dreamed of the last strike, freeing her people from endless war. Daniel spoke his father's words of how the sword must be saved for the right moment. The air grew heavy as both realized that their beliefs were pieces of the same truth. The sword's last strike was not hers alone, nor his alone. It was a choice that demanded unity. Outside, their armies clashed again, unaware that their leaders stood together in the ancient hall. The commander told Daniel that if they returned to the war, one would eventually fall to the other. The sword would burn the world before it was ever used as the stone intended. She asked him if humans were willing to share destiny with those they called enemies. Daniel looked at her, his grip tightening on the hilt. His answer was not spoken quickly. He said destiny was not about surrender or domination. It was about choosing to shape tomorrow, even if it meant walking beside an enemy. The commander's eyes softened, though her voice remained sharp. She told him the time for the last strike was close. And when it came, both armies would witness its truth. Daniel nodded, his spirit steady. He did not know if he could trust her, but he knew he could not deny what the sword had revealed. They walked from the chamber in silence, side by side, carrying the knowledge that their next battle would not just decide victory or defeat. It would decide whether the galaxy was torn apart or bound together by the final strike of a single blade. When Daniel and the commander returned from the canyon, their armies were still locked in fire and blood. The ground trembled with tanks, rifles roared, and alien blades cut through the dust. Yet when the two stepped onto the battlefield side by side, a hush spread across the field. Soldiers froze, uncertain they should fire or bow. The sight of sworn enemies walking together shook both sides. It was not peace yet, but it was the first crack in the wall of endless war. Daniel lifted his sword high, and its glow blazed brighter than ever. The commander spoke in her language, her voice carrying across the battlefield like thunder. Daniel spoke in his tongue, his words firm and sharp. Both called for the fighting to stop. The soldiers hesitated, caught between instinct and shock. Then slowly weapons lowered, and silence rolled across the ruins. For the first time since the war began, the battlefield was still. All eyes turned to the sword that seemed to carry the weight of choice. The human council was furious. Generals shouted that Daniel had betrayed them. They claimed he had broken loyalty by walking with the enemy. Some demanded his arrest. But the soldiers who had followed him through fire refused to raise a hand against him. To them, he had already become more than a commander. He was a living proof that the sword's power was not about destruction alone. The alien leaders were no different. Many of them called the commander a traitor for standing beside a human. Yet her warriors stood firm, refusing to leave her side. Two armies now wavered on the edge of rebellion against their own masters. Daniel and the commander met secretly that night in the ruins of a fallen tower. The fires of both camps glowed faintly in the distance. She spoke of her people's suffering, of centuries of chains and broken worlds. She believed the last strike of the sword would finally end their despair. Daniel listened in silence, then told her of the humans who had fought and died believing in him. He said the last strike was not for vengeance or freedom alone. It was for all, human and alien alike. The words hung heavy between them, carrying both hope and danger. The following days were filled with unrest. Soldiers from both sides began to gather in secret, whispering of what they had seen. Humans and aliens alike started to believe that the last strike could change everything. But there were others who feared it. Leaders on both sides planned assassinations, hoping to end the bond between Daniel and the commander before it grew. Twice, Daniel's camp was attacked by hidden blades. Twice, alien warriors tried to strike down their own commander. Yet both survived, the sword flashed in the dark as if protecting them even when they slept. The sword's glow grew brighter each day, its markings burning like fire against steel. Daniel felt its hum even when it rested across his back. The commander claimed the weapon was preparing for the final strike, that the moment was close. Daniel agreed, though his heart carried doubts. He knew the sword was more than a tool of fate. It was a mirror, reflecting the will of the one who carried it. The choice it demanded was not about prophecy or bloodline. It was about courage and the strength to choose unity instead of endless war. On the seventh night, the armies gathered once more. Neither council had control over them now. Soldiers came because they wanted to see what fate would bring. A vast circle formed in the ruins, with humans on one side and aliens on the other. At the center stood Daniel and the commander, blades in hand. The air pulsed with tension, every breath filled with expectation. It was no longer about orders. It was about truth that could not be avoided any longer. The commander raised her weapon, her eyes burning with fire. She asked Daniel if he still carried the sword for himself, or if he finally understood its destiny. Daniel drew the blade, its glow bathing both armies in light. His voice was calm as he answered that the sword's last strike was not his, nor hers. It was for the world to witness, for both sides to see whether they chose to die divided or live united. The silence that followed was deeper than any roar of war. All knew the final moment had come, and nothing would ever be the same after the blade fell. The battlefield was silent, a circle of soldiers holding their breath. Human and alien alike watched as Daniel lifted the glowing sword into the air. The commander stood across from him, her own blade gleaming, her fiery hair burning under the broken sky. The hum of the weapon filled the ruins, louder than the sound of wind or fire. Every heart waited for the choice that would decide their future. Daniel's grip was steady, though his chest felt heavy. He thought of his father's words, of the men who had followed him through fire, and of the commander who stood before with eyes filled not only with rage, but with hope. He saw the carvings in the canyon once more, the Emperor's promise carved into stone. The last strike was not meant for destruction alone. It was meant to bind what was broken. The truth rang inside him like thunder, unshaken and clear. The commander raised her voice so all could hear. She asked if he would finally give her the last strike, if he would honor the destiny written in her bloodline. Her words carried across the circle, sharp and demanding. Yet Daniel did not answer with haste. He stepped forward slowly, his sword blazing brighter with each breath. When he finally spoke, his words carried like steel. He said destiny was not given. Destiny was chosen, and he chose not to end the world, but to change it. He brought the blade down into the earth. Light burst outward, blinding in its brilliance. The ground shook as the sword's power released, not in fire to kill, but in light to heal. The ruins glowed, and the broken stone rose like waves before settling again. The shock of it swept through every soldier, human and alien, as the markings on the blade flared one final time. Chains of hate seemed to fall from the air itself. Weapons slipped from hands, not by force but by will. The last strike had not taken lives. It had ended the war. The commander fell to her knees, her blade dropping as her eyes widened. She looked at Daniel not with anger but with awe. She whispered that the last strike was promised to her, yet he had turned it into something greater than any prophecy. Daniel stood firm, the sword glowing faintly in his hands before its light faded forever. He told her that he had not saved the last strike for her death. He had saved it for her life, and for the life of every soldier watching. His words struck deeper than any blade. Both armies stood in silence, their hearts shaken by what they had witnessed. The human council could not command their men anymore. The alien leaders had lost their hold. Soldiers on both sides saw with their own eyes what the sword had done. It had proven that neither race could win by blood alone. Daniel and the commander stood at the center as symbols of a truth greater than war. For the first time, enemies laid down arms not from defeat, but from choice. The sword itself was now quiet, its glow gone, its power spent. Daniel sheathed it across his back, though he knew it was no longer the same. Its last strike was done, and it had chosen unity instead of destruction. The commander stepped beside him, no longer an enemy, but something different, something new. She told him that her people would follow this path, that they would remember this day not as the day they lost, but the day they began again. Daniel nodded, his heart steady. The weight of war finally lifted from his chest. As dawn broke, the battlefield became something else. Humans and aliens walked among each other, not as conquerors, but as survivors. The ruins no longer echoed with gunfire, but with the voices of those who had endured. Daniel looked at the horizon, the sword heavy yet peaceful against his back. The commander stood at his side, her fiery hair glowing in the morning light. Together, they faced the future, knowing that the last strike had not ended a world. It had built one,